Okay, Stat Pack, we've got a mind exercise today. I want you to close your eyes. Yes, you specifically, close them. I don't care if you're driving right now or if you're working a deli slicer at a butcher counter. Get them shut. Okay? I want you to imagine a place with a bustling downtown city boasting over 413,000 people, home of the Woody Guthrie Museum, and a 76-foot tall statue of an oil rig worker called Golden Driller. No, that's not paradise you're imagining. That's Tulsa, Oklahoma, and you too could live and work there. Obviously, you're already living somewhere else, so someone will need to pay you to move, but what would it take for you to relocate? $500? $550? $600? Well, hold on to your hats, because the city of Tulsa has been paying people $10,000 to relocate and work from there for at least a year in an effort to foster economic activity in the city. This is one of the first and largest of some 100 programs across the country. And according to a study by Upjohn Institute senior economist Tim Bartik, the return on investment has been approximately $4 for every dollar the city has spent. Well, someone puts out numbers and we have to look at them. So today we're talking about this study, the underlying incentives of the program, and how to think about the complications of but-for calculations. Hello, and welcome to Of Significance, the stats podcast where we leave no number unturned. I'm your everyman host, Brent Buckwright, here with two experts who knew big data before she got big. One puts the okay in Oklahoma and asks why it's not California, Dr. Nathan Woods, and the other extracts analyses like an oil man. It's Dr. Steve Bronars. Nathan, Steve, how are you?
I'm doing great, Brent. Thank you.
Howdy. How do you like that for adapting to the Tulsa topic?
That's perfect. All right, well, let's start there. Steve, what is this study? What should we be knowing about this program in the first place?
Yeah, let's start with some basics on the program. They've over the last several years, I think it's between 6,000 and 7,000 people that they brought in. But you have to apply to the program, and it seems like based on this study that we reviewed, about 17%, about 1 out of 6 people who apply get selected. And then some of them will end up moving, and then some of them won't. But even among the 83% who were rejected, obviously they had an interest in moving to Tulsa. I think you sold it pretty hard at the opening there. So they may just decide to move even if they don't get the 10,000. And then in terms of the follow-up, after 5 years, they're saying 55% of the people are still there. Of course, you have to be there for 1 year to get the money. And after 10 years, although I don't think even the longest one, people that came into the program would have been there 10 years, but they're projecting about a third would stay after 10 years. The other 2/3 would move on. And I think it's targeted towards college grads, remote workers, tech workers. They go through the whole application process, and it's not just like first come, first serve, or we're going to pick names out of a hat, one of my favorite random experiments, but they're going to actually try to select people that they think would benefit the city the most, that would be likely to be enticed by this $10,000 payment. And then I guess the other thing I would say at a high level is that there are some other costs. So really it's more like $15,000 to $16,000 given the other administrative cost per person that they end up bringing in to the city.
Right. So this program was started in 2018, and it's brought in some 3,400 people. I don't know how you have $5,000 extra per person in administrative costs. That seems pretty high, but
I think that's part of the takeaway and part of the reason why maybe, not to give anything away, but they saw this success that you described. And I think the author thinks that one of the reasons why is it's not just here's your $10,000, show up, but there's going to be a lot of support and facilitation for you, encouragement once you get there. because they're hoping that you show up, you get a good job. Hopefully you even start a business and start hiring other people. Right. So I think that extra 5,000 is kind of some of that facilitation cost.
Right, and I think I misspoke. And I think they selected between 6,000 and 7,000, of whom 3,300 came. 40-some% of those selected actually then decide to come. But then there's a whole bunch of other people whose applications they reviewed. They interviewed them. So there are some costs. I think you could divide it like the cost per applicant. Some of the costs are only through that process, and then I think Nathan's right. I think the more substantial other 5,000 in cost is the other support once you decide to move there. But yeah, you have to view the whole program as not just being the $10,000 that goes to the person moving. There is some overhead.
So this study by Tim Bartik, what was it trying to look at, and what were the questions it was trying to answer?
Great question. So I think that
thank you. I wrote it in advance.
He compares this to like a much more common thing, even though I was surprised that there are like 100 cities doing this, where you're trying to give tax incentives to businesses. And he has done a bunch of those studies, and he claims they have a much lower return because a lot of the businesses were going to move anyway to the city in question. So you're just giving them a windfall to show up there. It hasn't really changed their behavior. And so here, what he thinks is true, and again, that's where he does most of the kind of statistical analysis. A lot of the other things are really more calculations as opposed to estimation. Is he tries to see how much of an effect the $10,000 plus these other benefits that Nathan talked about would affect your likelihood of coming. So he runs one of these models. It's a 0-1. We've talked about selection models. And he looks at all the people that applied to the program. Some of them moved even though they didn't get the money. And then some of them got invited to come and were offered the money but turned it down. And so he's just trying to see what that effect is. He finds that about 60% of the people who receive the money would not have come but for the money. So he's doing what actually happened to what have happened but for. And he does it a couple of different ways, but that is really the key thing, because that is quite a big leap compared to what he says you would find in business tax incentives, where a lot of the companies that are responding to the incentives, if you had estimated a model, you'd say they probably would have made the move to this city. It's a big investment for them. There's reasons for them going there. Are they really at the margin? Would they move or not? And he would argue no. But here, they've selected people who it really makes a difference to them to get that money. And so with the money, they will make the move. Without the money, that he says they would not have. And I think that's why he finds the program so successful. So a lot of the, if you're going to say, what's the importance of this analysis, is how accurate is that kind of regression that he runs that is the basis of that 60% number.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious because with the size population you've got, I could easily see as a part of your on-take process, hey, we've decided you want to move to Tulsa for $10,000. We are going to accept you. Now, just before we give you the money, we could ask, would you have moved here if we didn't give you the money? And we could have that like as an easy data point. How does he tell exactly that this is a person who would have moved versus not?
Well, I think that it's a little bit tricky, because while they know that 40-some% of the people that they said, yes, we want you to come, they actually come, and the other ones don't, they really don't keep track of the people in the program that they said no to, because they could still end up moving to Tulsa anyway. So he's got a kind of a noisy measure of who's moving where from a data source that he says is a commercial business that keeps track of people's movements. And so he has a proxy for that. He can tell that people did move to Tulsa, both in the program or not. And he's looking kind of at that gap.
And let me just jump in. This part where he's describing the effort to put these pieces together to match people. He's got good kind of administrative data from the Tulsa remote folks. So we know something about you if you applied. We know even more about you if you interviewed, and we know the most about you if you've, gotten the offer and accepted and everything else. But he doesn't know as much about the people that didn't interview or didn't accept. And so he's matching that with this kind of this external consumer database. And I loved reading about that because it's like part of what we do at our job, right? They're basically like name matching and then trying to make that as robust as they can, given address and really, phone number. And
if you're nerds like us, it's really interesting to read that.
I assume whoever's listening are nerds like us. So
yeah. I mean,
in fact, they might be our friends and family.
Right. He has some limited information on where you were when you applied, but there are a lot of people with the same name or similar enough name. So he kind of weights it. So that, if there's like multiple Nathan Woods in an area, it's like, well, I'm not sure which of them applied but was rejected for the program and moved anyway. Right. So there's that.
So we'll take all 5 and then we'll divide it by 5.
Divide it. And I think the other thing that was interesting in that part was, I don't know if we won't mention the company, but they were missing a lot of movement. Like he was picking up like 1 out of 3. So for every 3 people that actually moved to Tulsa, he thinks the company's telling about 1. So he has to kind of scale everything up by that as well. So
yeah, but again, I like the kind of the insight into it's real data building, real data challenges. And he's, going to some trouble to explain all of that. But you're right. I mean, they're starting with this, 56 or something thousand applicants. And by the end, they're down around the numbers we talked about. An awful lot couldn't be matched because the information is just not available. And you got to kind of overcome and confront those challenges.
And they use different forms in different years. So the Tulsa remote, a different amount of information. He's got a lot of, when he wants to go to running the regression, he's got missing variables. So he puts in a dummy for missing variables. He really builds up the linear probability model because he's trying to get this sort of overall average effect. He's not really trying to predict exactly who it is. He's just trying to say, group 1 to compare to group 2, what's the delta in the chance of you moving? And that's where he gets that, and I'm just going to use kind of round numbers here, where if it was 42% of the people who moved conditional on getting the offer, the question is, what would that percentage be if they didn't get the offer? So you turn off that, did you get the offer, dummy variable, indicator variable in the regression, and you get the new one, and then that number is the one that's like 40% of what the 42% was. So what was it, like 17%? And that difference is the 60%. And the thing that he shows is that
a lot of percentages got thrown out there.
Yeah, I know.
The 4% of the 8% is the 60% of the 2%.
So
yeah, Yogi Berra could have said it even better.
Yeah.
Right. So, but the point is that if he doesn't include controls in the regression, he would overstate the impact of getting this offer because more college-educated people are more likely to move to Tulsa. Younger people, different demographic characteristics.
People who know people in Tulsa, people who used to live in Tulsa.
Right. There's a lot of stuff to look at that. So it kind of demonstrates the importance of the possibility of omitted variables affecting this. If you just looked at the raw numbers, you would think that the program itself was super effective at convincing people to move to Tulsa, whereas they're just already giving it to the $10,000 to people that have a higher propensity to move anyway. And like Nathan said, if they already used to live in Tulsa or have friends in Tulsa, then it's even higher. And so that's what you'd be really picking up if you didn't include those factors in the regression. So I think that's the other thing, in addition to a lot of these data problems, is he's hoping that he's got enough controls in there that he's isolating kind of the causal effect of the program on your movement, as opposed to, they're giving it to people that have a pretty high likelihood of moving to Tulsa anyway. And then the impact of the payment is really not as big as you might think.
Yeah, so I want to get into that, the impact of the payment, because all of the headlines about this report a 4x payout to the city as far as economic activity goes. That for every dollar the city invests, they get back 4. How did he get to this number? And we definitely have to dig into whether or not that makes sense and all the factors that are embedded assumptions there.
So I think the important way to start with this, Brent, is he's not counting the income of the people that move there. He's trying to be as fair about this as possible and say, we're going to look at the benefits to the people who are already in Tulsa. Because obviously the person coming to Tulsa, let's say they're making $100,000 a year. They may have been making $100,000 where they moved from. And so to count that as an extra $100,000 for Tulsa is a little bit, more likely to get you what looks like a good result. And while he says that's kind of an important thing, in some ways, he's trying to look at, does it benefit the people who are already there? So,
which is just apparently, based on what he's written, that's a little bit different, right? The individual kind of treatment and the folks that were already there, as opposed to some more aggregate GDP for the local area going up. He really wants to focus on the people that were there.
Yeah. And I think that you could imagine for the tax base and other things, it matters the people who are there. And so part of what helps is that when somebody moves, their spouse or other person in the household will move and they're going to work as well. So you kind of get 1.4 workers for the $10,000 on average. I think the other thing that helps is that they're college educated, and he says earlier studies, a lot of this is based on earlier studies, and you get a college worker to move to your town. In the long run, if that worker stays, it'll create about 0.6 of a job in the economy overall from a combination of things. And he put some stuff in there that says maybe that's even on the low side because, if these are especially going to be entrepreneurial or tech workers, but just from their spending and bringing income in, he thinks it's a net new 0.6 of a job if they end up staying there permanently. Now, what works against that a little bit is that not everybody's going to stay in the long run in Tulsa. So one way to think of it is you have to really pay for 3 households to come in. Each of them have 1.4 workers. And after 10 years, you'll have one that's a keeper, and that'll be 1.4 more jobs that through a spillover multiplier, whatever we call it, is going to each, create some extra jobs, extra economic activity. And that's really what he's trying to pick up is that kind of spillover effect. And he does a pretty careful job of trying to say that there are tax effects, but there's also spending on schools and police and other things. And so there are going to be winners and losers. I think everywhere you look in this, it's like, well, some people will benefit from this because they'll be spending money on the things that you're selling. Or if you're a worker, they'll be spending money in the industry that you work, and that'll mean more employment, maybe higher wages for you. And so he tries to do a careful job of lining all that up. But it's really like how much you're going to bring to the city and spend and put other people to work between that and possibly even starting your own business or other things like that, which I think, there's a much lower chance of that, but that could have a real big payoff if it occurs.
So I'm very interested in the methodology behind calculating this because when we do our analyses, baked in as an assumption is all else equal, that we're trying to look at how things compare to each other in a static world. And if you've got Tulsa enacting this program, maybe Tulsa actually did see a benefit of $4 for every $1 that was spent, but there are, dozens of other cities that are doing the exact same thing. If I'm trying to look at this and trying to get some takeaway about what the economic activity is, are there any problems of my just looking at what happens in Tulsa and thinking, well, if my city did this, we would get the same return?
I think one thing he says pretty clearly throughout, well, a couple things at least. One is the timing was very good for Tulsa. It's just as COVID was getting underway and people were experimenting with remote work. So that was not sort of a, an impossible thing for people to do. Whereas just a couple of years earlier, it wouldn't have crossed our minds to move anywhere and work remote. Even if we're mostly working at a computer. I think that's number one. Number two, and probably most critically, I think, is that Tulsa, and he might have more data on this in the actual report, but their housing situation was such that this influx of people didn't, unduly drive up housing prices and, make it painful to pay the price of living there for everybody who was already there. So they kind of hit a sweet spot with that. And I think one of his takeaways was, if you are thinking about doing this, you better make sure that you've got adequate housing supply on hand or a solution to that in conjunction with this kind of program. It just wouldn't work everywhere.
Yeah, and I think that, when we talk about the numbers involved here over this several year period, maybe it contributed to like 1% of the population, right? It's not like the experiment was, let's bring in 100,000 people. It'd be, I think it'd be unwise to try to extrapolate this out and just say you could multiply it and you would get the same 4-to-1 return if it was a giant program. And he's not saying that either. So it's got to be one of a bunch of different things that you would try, because I don't think that you would be able to accommodate a rapid influx without having some supply side issues, traffic going up, pressure on the city services, housing prices, rent going up, which he tries to account for. But it was a small enough supply of workers coming in, shifting, that I think those are relatively minor effects. I think the other thing that I think of, though, Brent, in response to your question is, if all this is true and somebody left another city in the Midwest to go to Tulsa, didn't that city lose the 0.6 jobs for each that each college person working would generate an extra, spillover multiplier effects? There seems to be kind of, if you think about it, maybe some kind of a zero-sum nature to it across the U.S. overall, unless the people that you get moving there are especially good fit with Tulsa. And I'm not sure exactly what criteria they use, but
or an especially bad fit wherever they're coming from.
Right. I think if you can get somebody to say, hey, this is a better fit for you, you're going to stay here longer, you're going to like it better, it's going to be a better job market for you, then that would kind of make sense. But if it's going from a very one situation to another, and you're doing it for the $10,000, but your situation is really no different, I don't really see where the economic gain is for us as a country to be doing this. But I do think it's interesting because they're going after the workers for these incentives, not the big businesses. So that is a little bit more appealing.
Isn't that going to be a little bit dependent on what kind of city someone is moving from and to? Because I could imagine that in an even smaller town that maybe doesn't have the same kind of infrastructure, they don't have the same set of institutions, that a larger city like a Tulsa might be able to more efficiently use a worker and make them more productive by that movement.
Yeah, and then there's the setting. There are colleges there. There's plenty of diversified industry there. There are opportunities there that may not exist in the same way in a smaller town, or at all in a small town. And then it may not be nearly as attractive. That's not a tiny city. They've got operas, they've got ballet, they've got cultural outlets, museums, outdoor activities. They do have the Woody Guthrie Center. I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
This land is your land.
Yeah. And I think that
yeah, that's true. Yeah,
it's true. They got that 75-foot statue
Yeah.
which is very iconic. The I think that you could ask that same question anytime somebody moves from one job to another. Is there any real social benefit to that, or is it basically more of the same? We're not doing a study of every time somebody makes a move, whether it's a geographical move or a move between two employers, but presumably they're moving and they think that their situation is going to be better off, and the people that they're going to go work for, they're going to make them better off, and there's some gains from this move that you're making. And I think what this might be addressing, there's also some frictions about that it is costly. There is some uncertainty with making a move, and maybe people are reluctant to do that. And this nudges them in that direction, and they're going to make a move that they think is going to turn out better. And more often than not, it might turn out to be better. But then again, like the study says, 2/3 of the people will end up not staying there after 10 years. So, you're appealing to a group that's pretty mobile, I think, is the key. And they might stay there, they might not. And you would hope that the ones who stay there are the ones that are getting the most out of it and contributing the most to the community.
So, kind of going back to the specific economic impact for Tulsa, my understanding is that when you're trying to lure businesses into an area, you've got a number of different methods of doing it. You could give them grants, or you could offer loans with kind of discounted rates, or you could potentially offer tax breaks for a certain period of time. This program, is targeting individuals and it's basically a cash grant. Did Bartik account for this in any way in trying to think about how people would choose to move as a business versus individuals?
I think the answer is no. I thought this was all, other than the discussion about in contrast to a business, this program's all about an individual.
Yeah, I think that is 100% true. He mentions, to put into some context, this 4-to-1 is like so much bigger. And he's done a bunch of these other kind of business incentive things where he said some of them, if they're poorly designed, they're money losers, right? And I think a big part of that is because you're giving money to this corporation, they would have moved anyway. He points out that in a lot of those, to the extent there is a positive from the business moving there, it's not in terms of the taxes paid. For whatever reason, the tax, I think it was a combination of things, but like you said, one of them is a tax break. So they're going to come and they're going to generate some jobs and generate some income for other people, but it is not going to pay for itself in terms of taxes. Whereas he said this doesn't quite, but it's pretty close to break even just on the taxes paid by the people coming in. So that's one difference. And then I think, the other thing that he really points out, and again, he just kind of gives in a broad brush what these business ones are. This really is benefiting, to a large degree, people in the top 20%, much more than the other people in the community. And, obviously the people that they're attracting are college graduates. And then I think the view of the spillover effects are going to be more towards people in the top 20%. And he said, kind of to be fair to these business ones, that's a little bit spread out more evenly and tends to have a better effect distributionally on the lower part of the income distribution. But I think his conclusion would be, this is such a good way to try to promote economic development. Even though a disproportionate share goes to the top 20%, there's so much more employment opportunities, higher wages, income being spent to go around. Even the lowest 20%, next 20%, they still benefit pretty well from this. So it's probably even better for them than the typical business project, which is, it'll probably break even, but it's not going to have anywhere close to a 4-to-1. He said, they usually would have maybe between break even or 2-to-1, but 4-to-1 would be
2
so
to
much
1
higher.
being exceptional. I
Yes.
guess,
Right.
in his experience.
In his experience. So this is like beyond exceptional.
Our producer, Kim, you look like you've got a question.
I do. I am trying to visualize who the people are who are considering this move. We know a little bit about their education. We know they're interested in the $10,000. But other than that, is there anything in the research about their age, their industries, the types of work they do? Anything else we should know about them and how they're benefiting the city of Tulsa?
Yes. And Steve, I don't know if you've got the list right in front of you, but there are definitely the report's pretty clear about, people's background, race, gender, industry, income, how closely connected you are to Tulsa, what state you might be coming from, or what region of the country you might be coming from. Like, for example, I don't think very many people are coming from as far as away as the Northeast or the great state of California, for example.
Yeah, I don't have it's a lengthy list. It definitely includes stuff like age and, the occupation and industry that you're in. I mean, most of these people, it's called Tulsa remote. So you can tell that it's skewing more towards people that can do their work remotely because the business is not moving within the Tulsa. They're not expecting to have to change their job. And that group of people has its own interesting mix of what they're bringing to the community. And I think what's clear from this study is that those people already have a kind of a high propensity to move anywhere. And so I think, the interesting thing that you're trying to do is you don't really want to give money if you're trying to get this 4-to-1 return. You don't want to give money to somebody that is going to move for sure. You want to give it to somebody who's like, yeah, I'm kind of torn. Maybe I should move. Maybe I shouldn't. And then you give them the $10,000 and it tips them over. If you offer it to somebody that's not that interested, it's not going to be enough to get them to move. So I was just fascinated by what are they looking at when they're going through the applications, and then they interview a bunch of people. And what are they asking? And if you wanted to game the system, you'd be trying to convince them that, like, well, I'm thinking about moving, because they want to know that you have that interest. But it really would depend on.
But I don't know. OKC seems pretty interesting.
That's right. Bartlesville.
Yeah.
It's a hot spot there. So I think it's a funny and interesting thing because they do know a lot about the people, and we kind of didn't talk as much about a lot of those variables. But the author of this study, he looks at them all, and some of the issues that he runs into that we did mention a little bit is that they changed the information they were collecting, and so in some years, some things, in other years, others. Some just they didn't record it for that person, maybe because they didn't get interviewed, they didn't get farther along in the process. So, but they do know quite a bit about the people.
Very similar, payroll systems changing, timekeeping system changing over time. We got to figure out how to navigate those changes. I really liked in what he was doing, and I'm kind of going backwards here, but he's got an interview sample that he's analyzing, as part of kind of his robustness checks to make sure that the results he's finding are robust to a whole bunch of different things. And he's got that little discussion of, what I like about that sample is, there's a bunch of unobserved stuff that got you into the interview population. And so by focusing just on the interview population, I can kind of control that out in some sense, even though I don't know what it is. But yeah, I think he did a really nice job in terms of those different on the first part, so the first part of the study on, did it really get you there or were you going to be moving there anyway? I thought he did a really nice job testing that out in a bunch of different ways, bunch of different models, little discussion of LPM versus Logit. Fantastic. We should get into that in a different episode.
We love to see it.
But I thought all of that was pretty robust and compelling.
So I want to do a little segment to wrap things up called Assessing the Assessment. Nathan, you just started talking about kind of your high-level thoughts about this study. So Steve, I want to start with you. How do you assess the kind of quality of this research? And are there any areas where you think it could improve or things you want to see maybe added to it, not saying he did anything wrong.
No, I think that it's a very lengthy study, and I just think that the one thing that you focus on with these numbers is like, okay, this is a single number, and while for some of the stuff that he's doing, it's using the kind of regression type methods, and they have a degree of statistical significance and confidence in the results. And then there are other things that he's just like doing these simulations. He's going, in this study, every time somebody like this comes in, it's this many more jobs, this many more dollars. And you're kind of missing like plus or minus what. And so he does do a bunch of sensitivity things, but I do think that there can be this tendency to say, well, based on previous studies, you bring in this household, 1.4 workers, each job leads to 0.6 more. That's 0.84 more workers. But I'm sure that estimate of 0.6 has quite a wide range, depending on what the 1.4 jobs are. So I think on average, it probably is close to these numbers. But I think that's one thing in these studies when you're doing these simulations and these calculations. It doesn't have the same kind of way of looking at it in terms of saying, is this really significantly different than that? And so I think he has that okay on the regression stuff. But the other things, it's pretty much you're plugging in these numbers from earlier studies to your simulations.
What about you, Nathan? Any more thoughts?
Well, I think Steve's right. I felt, and this probably gives away kind of what we do for a living, but I thought the first half of the paper, maybe it's the first third, where that's where he's going through the data, the regression techniques, all of those robustness checks was the most compelling, and the parts that were more assumption driven or based on kind of prior research, I think were maybe a little less. I don't think it's wrong, but maybe less compelling. But
you
then
realize it takes a ton of assumptions, man. That's the one thing as you're reading through it. Wow, there's a lot of assumptions. to figure this out.
Like 90 pages worth, and that doesn't even include the appendices. But I'll tell you what, I think I'm a low probability mover to Tulsa. I think my baseline probability is low. I think it was low last week. I think it's higher, but still low this week. Now that I know a lot more about Tulsa. Some of that I learned from the paper.
Watch Tulsa King, and it'll be even higher.
Some of that I learned from the paper. Some of it, I picked up from just researching generally. But it sounds like a fantastic place, and I'm a little more likely to move there today than I was before we did this episode.
But here's a practical question that no one's discussed. Anyone have any idea what the weather's like in Tulsa?
There's hail.
Yeah, I just did a quick search, and the National Weather Service says the main severe weather threats right now will be hail up to the size of ping pong balls and damaging winds to 70 miles per hour. Any commentary on that?
Well, The Outsiders was based there.
Yeah,
that's nice.
We're not meteorologists.
They've
we're
got
economists,
minor league baseball. That's great.
I think I'm more interested in moving to Tulsa so that I can help add 0.6 workers until we can eventually conglomerate a Frankenstein's monster employee.
I think just this episode might have contributed some fraction of a worker.
Yeah.
I think that the weather, I'm not sure. I know in Texas, in between like Wichita Falls and Waco, there's like a ton of tornadoes. I assume that stretches up somewhere into Oklahoma, but there's some crazy weather in that part of the country.
It's a whirlwind of a good time in Tulsa. All right. Well, we are always encouraging people to do studies, and especially effective ones. That's it for us. Thanks for listening. Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers, Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.